Hello, everybody, and welcome back from spring break. We're ready to move on from Jainism into Buddhism, one of the other religions that originated in India. Buddhism began in India in the 6th century BC as another interpretation of the Hindu religious system, and in many respects, it resembled Jainism because it rejected the authority of the Vedas, those holy books, and the caste system, or the Varnas, and it offered a vision of salvation based on individual effort. It differed from Jainism in that the Buddha taught a middle way between worldliness and the extreme of asceticism, that asceticism that was the example by Mahavira. As such, it held great appeal in India for several centuries. By the 3rd century BC, Buddhism developed something unusual for any version of Hinduism, a missionary imperative. The rulers of India, who were enamored with this new religion, sent Buddhist missionaries into Asian countries. And at the same time, Buddhism was developing new philosophies that became more and more attractive to the Asian peoples. This combination of missionaryism and new philosophies made it a sweeping success in China, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia. Yet while Buddhism was becoming a success in foreign missions, it was slowly being pushed aside in India by a resurgence in Hinduism. The Muslim conquest of India led to further decline of Buddhism there as well. While new converts had emerged or have emerged in the 20th century, particularly among the lower caste Hindus and many Tibetan refugees who now live in India, today the vast majority of Buddhists are found in East and Southeast Asia. I guess I should be going along here with the PowerPoint. So let's start with the life of the founder of Buddhism. The founder of Buddhism was a man named Siddhartha, and he was a member of the Gautama clan. And the dates usually given for his life are 560 to 480 BC. But however, the life of Gautama has come to be known, as it's been known, is surrounded by legend, and the exact dates of his life are subject to question. Nevertheless, he probably lived during the 6th century BC and was a contemporary of Mahavira. Gautama was the son of a Kshatriya Raja called Sudhodana and his wife Maya. And the legends say that the birth of the child was surrounded by extraordinary events. According to one story, a soothsayer predicted that the child would either become a great king who would rule the entire world or a great Buddha, an enlightened one. And Gautama's mother, Sud, died after his birth, and he was reared by his mother's sister, his maternal aunt, and she became his father's second wife. When Gautama was born, it was predicted that he would become a great king, but that if he ever saw the sights of human misery or the tranquility of a monk, he would grow up to be a religious leader. And because his father did not want that to happen, he sought to protect Gautama from the ugliness and distress of humanity. And so the Raja specifically sought to keep the young prince from seeing four sights: a dead body, an elderly person, a diseased person, and an ascetic monk. And so Gautama grew up surrounded by youth, beauty, and health. He received a normal education for a prince of that era. He studied the arts and warfare and received some training in philosophy. When he was 19, he married his cousin, and they shared a happy home. And they had one child, a son, and his name was Rahula. As Gautama got closer to his 30th birthday, he gradually became aware of the ugliness of the real world. And according to some legends, the gods, wishing to awake the future Buddha from the wasteful life he was living, conspired to break through the walls of youth and beauty that had surrounded him. And one by one, he became able to see the things that his father had forbidden. He saw a wrinkled and bent elderly person, a man with a terrible disease. He saw a rotting corpse, and he finally saw a peaceful monk who had renounced the world in search of a release from his suffering. And Gautama, reaching his mature years, became aware that life always involved suffering and pain. And it said that he once entered his harem room where there were some of the most beautiful young women in his kingdom. There he received a vision that these women would soon become wrinkled, gray, and stooped. And these revelations made it possible for the sensitive young prince to continue to live in his palace surrounded by ease and plenty. And then one night he decided to leave his home. He crept into his wife's bedroom and said farewell to her and their infant son. And then he took his best horse and he rode off into the night. And after riding a certain distance, he cut off all of his hair and his beard and sent the horse back to his father's palace. He changed his clothes with a beggar and began a period searching for answers to life's mystery. The name of his son, Rahula, translates to the word fetter, F-E-T-T-E-R. To be fettered by something means to be tied down. So even the name of his son was something that would have been something that to hold him behind, but he was able to escape it, and he was able to leave. And so he left his family, and at first Gautama thought the answers to the questions that troubled him most were to be found in many different schools of philosophy. So therefore he attached himself to a guru, a teacher, and studied with him for quite a while. And then he received no satisfaction at all with those studies. And so after that, he went on a second avenue, and he tried extreme asceticism. And as a solution to the problems of life, asceticism was an acceptable pursuit in the 6th century BC. As you know, we reflect back on the life of Mahavira and the Jains and his followers. Gautama joined 5 of their monks, and with them he began a life of severe asceticism that lasted for about 6 years. The ascetic measures Gautama took were as severe as any in the recorded history of religion. According to legend, he became something of a champion as an ascetic. He sought out anything that was unpleasant, painful, or disagreeable, and as a means by which that he could find release. He is supposed to have practiced fasting until he reached a point of living on a single grain of rice per day. And, a lot of Westerners, think of Buddha as a fat, jolly person because they have been influenced by Chinese statuary that depicts plump figures as Buddhas. These images, though, are not attempts to depict the historical Buddha. At this time in his life, Gautama reported that he became so thin that when he grasped for his stomach, he was able to touch his spine. He wore irritating garments and sat in awkward and painful positions for hours. He sat on thorns for a time and slept in a graveyard among the rotting corpses. In the tradition of many ascetics, Gautama allowed filth and vermin and lice to accumulate on his body. But, despite all those heroic efforts at asceticism, he did not find the enlightenment that he was seeking. The fat little happy statue we're used to seeing is actually a Chinese kitchen god called Budai, B-U-D-A-I. It's not actually a Buddha at all. It's just we've conflated the two names together. And that fat little Buddha is not the Buddha that is the founder of Buddhism. Apparently, the turning point in Gautama's quest came one day when he was walking near a stream. And because he had been terribly weakened by his different trials and ordeals, he fainted and he fell into the stream. The cold water revived him, and when he was able to, kind of sit back and contemplate his situation, he realized that although he had done everything that could be expected of an ascetic, he still had not found satisfaction. And so he therefore arose, walked to a nearby food stand, and ate a meal. Another tradition states that he received his first meal from a village woman named Sujata. His 5 friends happened to pass by, and they saw him eating and drinking and enjoying himself, and they called him a traitor. When Gautama finished his meal, he went to the banks of the river, sat down under the shade of a fig tree or a bodhi tree, and he began to meditate. And he decided to meditate until he received enlightenment. And at last, after a period of meditation, Gautama was enlightened from then on. He was known from then on as the Buddha, the enlightened one. And in his meditation, the Buddha had a vision of the endless cycle of birth and death that is, the lot of mankind. It was revealed to him that people were bound to this cycle because of something called tanha, Tanha, which is desire, a thirst, a craving. And so it is desire that causes karma and thus fetters people. Remember, I said his son's name to tie them down. The Buddha had desired enlightenment and had sought it through asceticism and knowledge, but it had eluded him. And when he ceased to desire it, he found enlightenment. When he let go and didn't search for it, it came to him. And so the first step the Buddha took after his enlightenment was to travel to the holy city of Benares. And he located the 5 ascetic friends who had, called him a traitor. And he found them in a deer park. A deer park was an open area usually owned by the local Raja for the purpose of hunting. And though at first those 5 ascetics had contempt for him, they listened as he preached. In his first sermon, the Buddha taught that neither the extreme of indulgence nor the extreme of asceticism was acceptable as a way of life, and that one should avoid extremes and seek to live in the middle way. The 5 ascetics noted the change that had come over Gautama as the Buddha, and they accepted his teachings. And these 5 formed the first Sangha, which is a Buddhist monastic order. They became Buddhist monks. The Buddha became enlightened when he was about 35, and he spent the remaining years of his life teaching his growing band of disciples. Unlike Orthodox Hindus, he taught that any person of any caste or sex could find the same enlightenment that he knew, and therefore his followers included a wide variety of people. When women asked to join his group, the Buddha was at first reluctant, but he eventually relented and allowed them to form an order of nuns. And according to legend, the Buddha's stepmother and former wife were among the first women to seek admission to this group of nuns. Unlike Orthodox Hindus and Orthodox Jains, early Buddhists taught that women, as well as men, could achieve enlightenment. People who seriously joined the Buddha as monks shaved their head, and they wore coarse yellow robes. Their only possession was a bowl that they carried as they begged for food. They had a creed, and it is said to have been, I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, which is the law, and I take refuge in the Sangha, the community. Lay Buddhists, those are people who are not monks or nuns, supported the Sangha with gifts of food, clothing, and other necessities of life. People who were lay Buddhists also were expected to observe 5 basic rules of moral conduct. They were to abstain from killing, they were to abstain from stealing, they were to abstain from lying, they were to abstain from engaging in improper sexual conduct, and they were not to partake of intoxicants. The monks sought to observe other rules that the Buddha laid out, and they were contained in something called the Pali sermons. And so the Pali sermon goes like this. And how, O king, is a monk to accomplish immorality? Herein a monk abandons the killing of living things and refrains from killing. Laying aside the use of a stick or a knife, he dwells modest, full of kindness, and compassionate for the welfare of all living things. This is his behavior in morality. Abandoning the taking of what is not given, he refrains from taking what is not given. He takes and expects only what is given. He dwells purely and without stealing. Abandoning incontinence, he practices continence and lives apart, avoiding the village practice of sexual intercourse. Abandoning falsehood, he refrains from falsehood. He speaks the truth. He is truthful, trustworthy, and reliable, not deceiving people. Abandoning slanderous speech, he refrains from slanderous speech. What he has heard from one place, he does not tell in another to cause dissension. He is even a healer of dissensions and a producer of union, delighting and rejoicing in concord, eager for concord, and an utterer of speech that produces concord. Abandoning harsh speech, he refrains from harsh speech, the speech that is harmless, pleasant to the ear, kind, reaching the heart, urbane, amiable, and attractive to the multitude. That kind of speech does he utter. Abandoning frivolous speech, he refrains from frivolous speech. He speaks to the good, the real, the profitable, of the doctrine and the discipline. He is an utterer of speech worth hoarding, with timely reasons and purpose and meaning. He refrains from injuring seeds and plants. He eats only one meal at one mealtime, abstaining from food at night and avoiding untimely food. He refrains from seeing dancing, singing, music, and shows. He refrains from the use of garlands, scents, unguents, and objects of adornment, from a high or large bed, from accepting gold and silver, from accepting raw grain and raw meat. He refrains from accepting women, girls, male and female slaves, goats and rams, fowls and pigs, elephants, oxen, horses, mares, and farmlands. He refrains from going on messages and errands, from buying and selling, from cheating and weighing, false metal, measuring, from practicing of cheating, trickery, deception, and fraud, from cutting, killing, binding, robbery, pillage, and violence. That was quite a list of things that the monks were supposed to have to follow. The Buddha reportedly died at the age of 80 after eating spoiled pork curry, which had been offered to him freely. And as the tradition, according to the tradition, his final words were, "Subject to decay are all component things. Strive earnestly to work on your own salvation." So, what does the Buddha teach? There is nothing in the life and teachings of the Buddha to indicate that he intended to found a new religion. He understood life in Hindu religion's categories and taught his followers to use those categories and vocabulary. The Buddha was opposed to many of the various existing forms of religious worship. He certainly was opposed to the Brahmin system of animal sacrifice. In addition, he rejected the authority of the Vedas. The Buddha accepted many Hindu teachings concerning the gods, but considered them mortal beings, subject to the laws of karma and rebirth. And while Buddhism teaches that gods have great powers, the Buddha much more was concerned that people find their own enlightenment than appeal to the gods for their help and support. Among the unique teachings of the Buddha, though, was that the soul did not exist. According to the Buddha, people live in a state of anatman, or non-soulness. What is called the soul is actually a combination of 5 mental or physical aggregates: the physical body, feelings, understanding, will, and the consciousness. This combination, which makes up the human personality, is bound to the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth that is typical in Indian religions. The Buddha's understanding of humankind's plight is the classic Buddhist statement of the 4 Noble Truths. And he said, "And what, monks, is the middle path, of which the Tathagata has gained enlightenment, which produces insight and knowledge, and tends to calm, to higher knowledge, enlightenment, nirvana? This is the noble eightfold way, namely right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. This, monks, is the middle path, of which the Tathagata has gained enlightenment, which produces insight and knowledge, and tends to calm, to higher knowledge, enlightenment, nirvana." Now, monks, is the noble truth of pain. Birth is painful, age is painful, sickness is painful, death is painful. Sorrows, lamentations, dejection, and despair are painful. Contact with unpleasant things is painful. Not getting what one wishes is painful. In short, the 5 groups of grasping are painful. Now this, monks, is the noble truth of the cause of pain, the craving, which tends to rebirth, combined with the pleasure of lust and pleasure, finding pleasure here and there, namely the craving for passion, the craving for existence, the craving for non-existence. Now this, monks, is the noble truth of the cessation of pain, the cessation without a remainder of craving, the abandonment, the forsaking, the release, the non-attachment. Now this, monks, is the noble truth of the way that leads to the cessation of pain. This is the noble eightfold way, namely right views, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. The person who follows the eightfold path will break the bonds that tie one to life and will achieve release from the cycle. The word used to describe this release is nirvana, which basically means extinguished or to be put out like a candle. This goal of basic Buddhist practice is not the achievement of a state of bliss in some heaven, but it's actually the extinguishing of the tanha, the desire. So when tanha is extinguished, one is released from the cycle of life that includes birth, suffering, death, and rebirth. One who has followed the Eightfold Path and has arrived at the point of achieving nirvana is called arhat, or a saint. The teachings of the Buddha became the basis for an organization that took on many components of a religion. His followers organized themselves into a monastic order called the Sangha. His teachings became codified in the laws of that order and in various forms of scripture. The Buddha himself came to be regarded as the greatest of beings, and the rulers under which early Buddhist monks were expected to live are noteworthy because they demonstrate the practical outworking of the Buddha's teachings. The teachings of the Buddha differed radically from those of the Indian religions of his day, though. He denied the relevance of the gods and the necessity of worship or sacrifice, and although the Buddha shared the Indian idea that the goal of life was relief from his existence, he taught that the release depends totally on the works of the individual. Persons attracted to the teachings of the Buddha during his life must have been a special group of very intelligent people who were very dissatisfied with life and had the capacity to discipline themselves. And had Buddhism remained as it was in the beginning, it is doubtful more than a handful of people would have been interested in it. In the 21st century, however, Buddhism is one of the major religions of the world. Its devotees are found in nearly every Asian nation and in many other parts of the world. The path by which Buddhism was transformed into one of the largest religions is quite fascinating. And so, as in the case with almost every other founder of a religion, before the Buddha had been dead very long, his followers were debating the meaning of his teachings, and according to one tradition, a schism occurred between the disciples the day after his death. Within a year of his death, his followers called a council to try to determine the true meaning of his teachings. And this council failed to bring unity within a short period, and there were 4 major Buddhist factions. And during the next 10 years, the number increased to more than 16. In the year 390 BC, a second council was called for a conservative minority that declared the majority of Buddhists to be heretics. And from this point onward, Buddhism has been divided into these 2 major camps, which have turned into different sects or numerous sects. The smaller one and more conservative wing of Buddhism is known as Hinayana, and this is known as the exclusive way. At one time, there have been as many as 18 schools within the Hinayana movement, and today the most dominant Hinayana school is called Theravada, and Theravada means the tradition of the elders. The larger and more liberal segment is known as Mahayana, and that is the expansive way. And the basic differences between these 2 sects will be discussed here in a little bit. Buddhism received its greatest impetus when the Emperor of India, Asoka, converted to the new religion. It's said that Asoka was to Buddhism what Constantine I was to Christianity. In both cases, these rulers of large empires were converted to what had previously been small, struggling religions. Both emperors then threw the power of their thrones behind their new faiths from that point onward, and these religions grew rapidly. Asoka, who ruled from 268 to 232 BC, had been converted to Buddhism in 297. Is that back here? Yeah, there it is. And he became convinced that, unlike other religions of India, Buddhism was potentially the religion for all the people of the world. And so he was the first Buddhist to send out missionaries to carry the teachings of Gautama and urge non-Indians to accept them. And Asoka sent his son Mahindi to Ceylon, which is modern-day Sri Lanka, where the king and his court were converted. And today, Sri Lanka boasts the longest history of Buddhism of any Indian nation outside of India. Other emissaries carried the Buddhist message to Burma, and the 13 Rock Edict of Asoka claims that the missionaries went as far west as Syria and Greece. Asoka's decision to spread his religion proved to be the salvation of Buddhism, because Buddhism virtually ceased to exist in India centuries later. Asoka also called the Third Council of Buddhism in 247 BC to determine the authoritative list of Buddhist scriptures. Despite the enormous unifying work of Asoka and others, the first century AD, by the first century AD, many major and minor sects of Buddhism existed. The most distinct split was between the Theravādas and the Mahayanas. So here we'll talk about the Theravādas. Theravada Buddhism is the more conservative of the two major divisions within this religion. As such, it believes itself to be closer to the original teachings of the Buddha. The major locations of Theravada Buddhism today are Sri Lanka and in Southeast Asian nations of Burma, which is now Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos. There are also large communities of Theravada Buddhists in Europe, Australia, and North America. According to Theravada Buddhism, people must achieve enlightenment for themselves without reliance on the gods or on any force beyond themselves. And for this reason, the monk is the ideal figure. It is he who shaves his head, puts on the yellow robe, takes up the begging bowl, and seeks relief from life through meditation and self-denial. His home is the Sangha, as it is with the days of the Buddha. When a monk achieves the goal he is seeking, he becomes a saint. And when the saint dies, he attains nirvana, and thus released from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, the most common lot of humankind. There is no suffering for him who has finished his journey and abandoned grief, who has freed himself on all sides and thrown off all fetters. They exert themselves with their thoughts well collected. They do not tarry in their abode, like swans who have left their lake. They leave their house and home. Men who have no riches, who live on recognized food, who have perceived void and unconditioned freedom, nirvana, their path is difficult to understand, like that of the birds of the air. He whose appetites are stilled, who is not absorbed in enjoyment, the gods even envy him, whose senses, like horses well broken in by the driver, have been subdued. He who is free from pride and free from appetites. In a hamlet or in a forest, on sea or dry land, wherever venerable persons dwell, that place is delightful. That is the centrality of Theravada Buddhism. So if a Theravada Buddhist cannot or will not join the Sangha and become a monk, then that person must be content to lead a life as a layperson. And they support the needs of the monks and hoping to be in a better position in another life. That way, they may not become a saint in this life, they may become a saint in the next life. One need not make a lifelong commitment to the monastic life. Most Theravada men become monks as a rite of passage from youth to adulthood. Monks are free to leave the Sangha at any time. Many Theravada Buddhists temporarily put on the robes, as ordination is called, for a period of weeks or months to mark critical stages in the course of life, or when life's pressures become too much to bear. Theravada Buddhism, like the Buddhism of Gautama, teaches the goals of religion are reached through the efforts, meditation, and achievements of the individual. The gods, sacrifice, and prayer are of minor consequence. However, certain traditional religious elements have evolved. For example, relics of the life of the Buddha have become important to Theravadins. His bones and possessions have become objects of veneration at many important sites of Theravada life. One of the early Buddhist missionaries reportedly took a branch from the sacred bo tree under which the Buddha found enlightenment and planted it in Sri Lanka. The resultant tree is thought to be the world's oldest living tree. And just as Jains believe that there were many Tirthankaras in the past, Theravada Buddhists believe that there have been many Buddhas in the past and that there will be more in the future. A Buddha, after all, is only a human being who has discovered the path to nirvana through his own efforts. There are many stories concerning the lives of the former lives of Buddha Siddhartha Gautama. They are known as the Jataka tales, which concern the future Buddha's cultivation and the moral virtues required for Buddhahood. The Jatakas are among the most common themes in Buddhist art and are the subject of sermons and popular religious texts in all of Theravadan societies. The characteristic physical structure of Theravada Buddhism is a complex of buildings called a wat. The most important building in the wat is the bat, or the vihara, a hall used for teaching, preaching, and meditation. Usually, this hall contains a statue of the Buddha with many altars, candles, and incense. Another portion of the hall may have raised seats for lecturing teachers and preachers. Other buildings within the wat include the living quarters for the monks and a number of graceful towers known as stupas, or pagodas. Some speculate that pagodas may have begun as relic mounds, but today they serve as worship or festival centers for the Buddhist community. Some of these pagodas, believed to contain the relics of the Buddha or arhats, lay people often visit and make offerings at these shrines. Their purpose, however, is not to worship the Buddha or the enlightened saints, but to pay respect to the ideas of Buddhahood and nirvana and dedicate themselves to the quest of spiritual liberation. Pagodas are also used as places of meditations by both monks and lay Buddhists. There are two types of Theravada meditation. Samatha meditation involves the intense concentration, the purpose of which is the attainment of the spiritual states that open the path to enlightenment. Vipassana is insight meditation. Its purpose is the sudden, intuitive realization of Buddhist truths and is modeled on the experience of the Buddha under the Bo or the Bodhi tree. All right, let's go ahead and take a step here into Mahayana Buddhism. Okay, so in the 3rd century BC, when King Asoka was spreading the teachings of Buddhism through his missionary efforts, certain subtle changes began to occur in the religion. One of the basic assumptions underlying these new developments was that, in addition to what the Buddha had openly taught his disciples, there were many other principles he had secretly taught, but only to a select group who could be counted on to properly understand them. A favorite story of the Mahayanists is, as the Buddha was teaching, he took a handful of leaves from the forest floor and explained to his disciples that as the leaves in his hand were less than the total leaves of the forest, so were the teachings that he had given them openly less than the total amount of truth that could be imparted in secret. Mahayana Buddhism simply picked up a few more of the leaves. Once this assumption was accepted, it was possible to accept fresh and expansive interpretations of basic Buddhist concepts as part of the Buddha's original teachings. A second principle that began to develop in Mahayana Buddhism between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century BC was that Gautama was really more than a man, in contrast to the teachings of early Buddhism and those of the Theravada school. The Mahayanists began to teach that Buddha was really a compassionate, eternal, and almost divine being who came to earth in the form of a man because he loved humankind and wished to be of their assistance to them. The third principle that Mahayanists put forth was that Gautama was not only the Buddha to whom people could appeal. If Gautama was the eternal being who had come to earth to help people, the Mahayanists maintained that there must be many others. The Mahayana teaching is that there are many Buddhas located in different parts of the cosmos, all of whom are capable of helping people on the path to enlightenment. This new idea did more than anything to broaden the appeal of Buddhism. If there were many such eternal beings who were compassionate and had come to earth to help suffering people, these beings were worthy of veneration and respect. Whereas Gautama had been unconcerned about the gods and worship, and it had meant little in the scheme of things, Mahayanists could now focus their religious attention on these many eternal Buddhas. They could study their lives and build temples for them. Clergy could be trained in worshiping them, and cultic systems of ritual, sacrifice, hymns, and the like could be established on their behalf. This development was also essential to the Buddhist missionary movement. When Buddhist missionaries entered a new country, they did not have to ask natives to give up their old gods. These gods were seen as various incarnations of the Buddha, and their cults could continue. In the same way that Hinduism absorbed Buddhism by saying that Gautama was an avatar of Vishnu, Buddhism absorbed many other religions by saying their gods were really incarnations of Buddha. And Mahayanists also developed a class of beings called the Bodhisattvas, who could provide help for human beings struggling with the problems of life. It was taught that certain beings had taken vows to become bodhisattvas, which are future Buddhas, and at some point during their lives. Then, by living exemplary lives, they could acquire merit. And following death, these bodhisattvas postponed their achievement of nirvana until such a time as all living things could attain it, and then they could share their merit with humankind. Some of the bodhisattvas were thought to reside in heaven, while others continued to be incarnated as human beings. They were all believed to respond to the prayers of those who needed their help, and the Mahayana concept of the bodhisattva is based on earlier Buddhist and Theravada Jataka tradition, in which the future Buddha is referred to as the bodhisattva. Mahayana differs from the older, more conservative Buddhist tradition in that the bodhisattva came to be seen as saviors and as one of the primary objectives of popular devotion. The teachings of the Buddha were carried into China sometime after they became popular in India. And there's some evidence that Hinayana Buddhism had achieved a foothold in China in the 1st century AD. However, it was not until the 3rd century AD when Mahayana was introduced and that Buddhism really began to take hold there. From that era onward, Buddhism became one of the 3 major religions of China, alongside the native Confucianism and Taoism. From China, Mahayana Buddhism spread to other East Asian nations. Because of its close ties to China, Korea was brought under the influence of Buddhism as early as the 4th century AD. The spread to the east continued until the 6th century, when Buddhism entered Japan. The Japanese at first refused to accept this new religion, but after a short time they embraced it to the point that it came to share religious leadership with the native Shinto. Mahayana Buddhism also spread to Indonesian islands of Java, Sumatra, and Bali. Chinese pilgrims en route to India often stopped for a period of months or even years in the islands of Southeast Asia to improve their knowledge of Sanskrit and Buddhist doctrine. Other Asian nations, such as Mongolia and Tibet, also accepted versions of Mahayana Buddhism, and because of the remote locations of these countries, their versions of the religion developed along slightly different lines than it did in other places, and today they still remain quite unique. While Buddhism was becoming a great source of success as a missionary religion in the East and Southeast Asia, it was gradually dying in India. Buddhism suffered from absorption by Hinduism. Because Hinduism is open to and tolerates other religions, it was able to absorb the distinctive qualities of the major challenging religions of Jainism and Buddhism. And by the 7th century AD, it absorbed many Buddhist features, simply by stating that Gautama was an avatar of Vishnu. Therefore, anything new, important, or distinctive about Buddhism came to be understood as an expression of Vishnu within the Hindu scheme of things. Waves of invasions, particularly the Islamic invasions in the 11th through 13th centuries, destroyed many Indian centers of Buddhist strength. In those times, many Buddhists converted to Islam. With the destruction of Buddhist kingdoms, monasteries, and temples found it difficult to survive. And although Hinduism somehow had the resiliency to survive the transition of Muslim rule, Buddhism in India did not. So let's talk about some of the different sects of Buddhism. All right, so in Mahayana Buddhism began as the religion open to innovation and change, and as it spread and developed in various Asian nations, it acquired many new concepts from these peoples. Therefore, we do not speak of Buddhism today as a single religion, but as a family of religions within this family. Nearly every form of religious expression can be found in this type of Buddhism. So the first one is the Pure Land sect. Sometimes it's known as Qingtu and Jodo. One of the most popular and widespread branches of Mahayana Buddhism is the so-called Pure Land sect. The goal of its adherents after death is a paradise called the Land of Bliss. And Mahayanists believe that there have been many Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and among these are the Dhyani Buddhas, who preside over heaven-like Buddha lands in which it is possible to cultivate Buddhist virtues and in which evil does not exist. One of the most popular of these cosmic Buddhas is Amitabha. Amitabha presides over a western paradise called the Pure Land. His followers believe that living a virtuous life and reciting Amitabha's name will lead to rebirth in this world. This world, Sukhavati Ananda, which is the world system of the Lord Amitabha, is rich and prosperous, comfortable, fertile, delightful, and crowded with many gods and men. And in this world system, Ananda, there are no hells, no animals, no ghosts, no asuras, and none of the inauspicious places of rebirth. And in our world, no jewels make their appearance like those which exist in the world system Sukhavati. And the world system Sukhavati Ananda emits the many fragrant odors. It is rich in a great variety of flowers and fruits adorned with jewel trees, which are frequented by flocks of various birds with sweet voices, which the Tathagata's miraculous power has conjured up. And these jewel trees, Ananda, have various colors, many hundreds of thousands of colors. They are variously composed of 7 precious things in varying combinations: gold, silver, beryl, crystal, coral, red pearls, or emerald. Some jewel trees and clusters of banana trees and rows of palm trees, all made of precious things, grow everywhere in the Buddha field. To the Pure Land Buddhists, the emphasis is on faith in Amitabha, and some members of this sect believe that simply uttering the name of Amitabha many times during the day will aid in the achieving of the land of bliss. With faith in Amitabha as its central premise, and eternity in the Pure Land as its goal, this version of Buddhism is quite different from that originally taught by the Buddha. It is possible for the Pure Land monk to marry, have children, and live in the world in a manner very similar to that of the layperson. Worship of the Pure Land, for the Pure Land devotee, often occurs in what may be best described as churches. In fact, some Pure Land congregations in Western nations use that title. Pure Land Buddhists may have Sunday schools for the religious instruction of their children, and they may meet for worship in congregations, may hear sermons from their clergymen, and may offer prayers to Amitabha. All right. So let's go now to the intuitive sects. The intuitive sects, known as Chan or Zen, is what you may have heard it as. There has always existed a group within Buddhism that has emphasized the truths of religion, and that those truths do not come through rational thought processes, study of scripture or faith, but rather through a sudden flash of insight. These groups usually trace their origins to the experience of the Buddha under the bo tree. You can recall here that the Buddha realized he had not found the truth that he had sought through study with the Brahmin gurus, or after 5 years of extreme asceticism. He therefore resolved to meditate. He sat under the bo tree for several weeks, and the truth came to him in a flash of inspiration. Advocates of this position maintain that the intuition or inspiration that comes after a period of meditation is the key to Buddhist truth. These groups have been known throughout the Buddhist world as being meditative or intuitive Buddhists. In India, the word for meditation is dhyana in Theravada countries, and it is associated with Vipassana meditation schools. In China, it is Chen, and in Japan, it is Zen. Although these Buddhists believe that the Buddha himself received his knowledge intuitively and taught his disciples in this manner, the actual founding of the intuitive sects did not take place until sometime in the 5th century AD. This was brought about with the work of a monk, and his name was Bodhidharma. And a great deal about the life of Bodhidharma is legendary, however, and it seems clear that in the late 5th century or early 6th century, the concepts of intuitive Buddhism entered China from India. From China, they were carried to Korea and Japan, where the version of Buddhism is now known as Zen. According to legend, at the invitation of the Chinese emperor, Bodhidharma went as a missionary from southern India to Canton in 470 AD. There he taught the emperor that his scripture, monasteries, and philanthropy availed him nothing. The truth of Buddhism, he taught, is to be found only through meditation and sudden insight. Again, according to legend, when he had finally finished teaching the emperor, Bodhidharma retired to a cave in the mountains, where he spent 10 years meditating while facing a wall. During this time, his lower limbs withered, and he was no longer able to walk. A purely apocryphal story says that the Bodhidharma wished to stay awake for many hours and meditate, but he kept falling asleep. In a fit of anger at his own inability to stay awake, the monk took a knife and cut off his eyelids. The eyelids fell to the ground and sprang up as a tea plant. Therefore, depictions of Bodhidharma show him with harsh, staring eyes and no eyelids. Legend also has it that Bodhidharma brought tea from India to China. It is true that about this time tea was introduced from India to China and later to Japan, and that the intuitive monks began to heavily use caffeinated tea as a means of staying awake to meditate longer. The principle behind all of the intuitive sects of Buddhism is that enlightenment is an individual matter and therefore cannot receive much help from other persons or institutions. Excuse me. Individuals find enlightenment through meditation and the realization that the Buddha nature is within themselves. While externals of religion, including the study of texts, monastic discipline, temples, and images, are important in Zen Buddhism, only direct insight can yield enlightenment. Zen teaches that all people must learn the real truth about religion and life for themselves through their own experience. One can become enlightened while sitting under a tree or sweeping a floor. According to the intuitive sects, reason is to be distrusted because it cannot be possibly lead people to the real truth. In fact, people must deliberately confuse reason before they can find the truth. Therefore, Zen Buddhism uses riddles that are carefully constructed to go beyond reason and to confuse reason in order to lead to the initiates, lead them into enlightenment. Such riddles of Zen are called koans. Or case studies, K-O-A-N-S. Excuse me again. Entire books have been filled with these riddles and tales and short statements used by Zen masters to aid their pupils. Perhaps best known to Westerners is the simple statement, "Have you heard the sound of the clapping of two hands?" But what is the sound of one hand clapping? Excuse me again. This question makes no sense, but it is designed to induce the initiate to go beyond sense or reason and to ponder. Another koan frequently given to students is, "What was your face before your parents were born?" Still another is, from where you are, stop the distant boat from moving across the water." The pupil of Zen first meditates. When the pupil's mind is cleared of the day-to-day matters and is finally ready to be released from reason, the master gives the student a riddle. It is hoped that while the novice meditates on one of these nonsense statements, a flash of enlightenment, called satori, will lead the initiate to the truth beyond reason. In addition to riddles, Zen masters use other devices to bring students to insight. Generally, any device that confuses the reasoning processes of the pupil will be used. A Zen master might suddenly shout at or even slap or kick the student to do this. Tales from Zen monasteries tell of masters striking their pupils with sticks or even cutting off one of their fingers in an attempt to cause intuitive flashes. The occasions of brutality are the exception rather than the rule, however. It is in Japan that intuitive Buddhism has had the most profound effect on society. The Zen principles of beauty, simplicity, and profundity have deeply touched many areas of Japanese life. Because tea was introduced along with intuitive Buddhism, tea drinking and the rituals that surround it have been affected by Zen principles. The architecture of the tea house, the pottery used in the tea ceremony, the music played during the tea ceremony, the poetry that is recited, and the floral arrangements that decorate the tea house all reflect the principles of Zen. In Japanese art, what is most highly valued is the controlled accident. That is, art that is not purely planned or contrived is valued above that which is planned. A teapot that is accidentally broken and glued back together with gold-colored cement is more valued because of the beautiful accidental lines of the breakage than a teapot with a contrived design upon it. A drawing of on very porous paper with pen and ink that cannot be erased and corrected is considered more beautiful than one that has been planned, worked out carefully, and corrected by the artist. Thus, the concepts of beauty in Japanese life are heavily influenced by the non-rational approach of Zen. We have the rationalist sect next. This is known as Tendai. Whereas the intuitive sects of Zen tended to distrust the rational process and felt that they had little need for scripture in their search for enlightenment, another group that arose in China in the 6th century taught that in addition to meditation, one should use reason and study for the scriptures to discover the truth about Buddhism. This sect, which is called Tendai, was founded by a monk named Chi. According to Chi, the Buddha had used various methods during his lifetime to teach his truths. At one point, he taught the Theravada doctrines. At another time, he felt he could communicate better teaching using the Mahayana doctrines. And still another, he thought he could teach in a manner similar to used in Zen. But in reality, there's only one true Buddhist teacher and Buddhist teaching, and individuals must study the scriptures of Buddhism to know this truth. Therefore, although meditation may be helpful at certain times, this is not the only path, and rational thoughts and study should not be disregarded. In the 9th century, the teachings of Chi were introduced in Japan, and that's where it gained its name of Tendai. So then next one here is the socio-political sect. This is known as Nichiren. So from time to time, the various sects of Buddhism have come together to have great effect on the social and political life of various nations. And one such sect is the Nichiren, which means sun lotus, the Nichiren Buddhist group, which is a purely Japanese phenomenon. The founder of Nichiren lived in Japan in the 13th century AD, and he was the son of humble parents, and at the age of 15, he entered a Tendai Buddhist monastery. And during his 10 years there, he came to believe that all of the current sects of Buddhism were a perversion of the true teachings of the Buddha. He also came to believe that the Lotus Sutra was the only scripture a person needed to study to become a correct Buddhist. And so while meditating on this sutra, he underwent a conversion. He changed his name to Nichiren, took a vow to faithfully follow and teach the Lotus Sutra, and set forth on a career of preaching and polemics with a fervor reminiscent of many of the Jewish prophets. He had preached that he alone understood the truth of pure Buddhism, and that the other sources of Buddhist sects like Zen and Pure Land and so on were preaching falsehoods and leading people to hell. Because most Japanese people followed these false sects, the nation was suffering from internal and external woes, according to Nichiren. Naturally, this kind of preaching aroused powerful enemies, and Nichiren was twice deported and twice condemned to death by Japanese authorities. Throughout its history, Nichiren